Welcome to week 21 in our study of Genesis, and what an interesting week this is. I'm recording this in advance from our home because on this day, February the 9th, 2014, the Lord willing, Sherry and I will be excavating the ruins of Sodom, the city of Sodom, and here our study this week is on the city of Sodom and its destruction. Isn't it amazing when the Lord brings something together? We started this Genesis study many weeks ago, and through all of the schedule changes and everything, it turns out that we're going to study the lesson of Sodom. The class will be studying it while Sherry and I, James and Jim Edwards, Tina Mullins, and our pastor William Attaway are all on location excavating. And in fact, because the Muslim weekends are Friday and Saturday, and they work Sunday through Thursday, this being a Sunday, we'll be physically out at the site excavating the ruins of Sodom. So we're certainly excited about the trip that's coming, and excited about sharing our experiences when we return. So for this week then, we're in lesson 21, and we're in Genesis chapters 18 and 19, which are about primarily God letting Abraham know that he's going to destroy the city. Abraham, realizing Lot and his family live there, argues with God, but eventually, after Lot is removed from the city is destroyed. And so let's just go ahead and begin to look at our first question this morning. And the question says in Genesis 18:1, we read that the Lord appeared to Abraham. How is he, that would be the Lord, how is he described in verse 2? And so we read in Genesis 18:1 and 2, Now the Lord appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre, and while he was sitting at the tent door in the heat of the day, this is Abraham, when he lifted up his eyes and looked, behold, 3 men were standing opposite him. And when he saw them, he ran out from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the earth. And so when God appeared in front of Abraham, he appeared as 3 people. And we will discover here shortly that 2 of those are angels. And so our second question is, how do we know that the Lord was one of the 3 visiting Abraham? Well, you can read this in Genesis 18:16 through 22. So let's turn there. In Genesis 18:16 through 22, it says, Then the men rose from there, they were at Abraham's, and looked down towards Sodom, and Abraham was walking with them to send them off. And this would be the 3 men now. And the Lord said, Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Since Abraham will surely become a great and mighty nation, and in him all the nations of the earth will be blessed. For I have chosen him, so that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring upon Abraham what he has spoken about him. And the Lord said, The outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah is indeed great, and their sin is exceedingly grave. I will go down now and see if they have done entirely according to its outcry, which has come to me, and if not, I will know. Then the men turned away from there and went towards Sodom, while Abraham was still standing before the Lord. So we had 3 people. The Lord is still standing in front of Abraham, so the 2 angels, and we'll see them in the story later, head towards Sodom. And in fact, we can jump ahead a little bit to 19 verse 1. And we read, Now the 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening, as Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. So we know there were 3 men who met with Abraham. We know that 2 of them were angels. They would be the 2 that would go to Sodom and rescue Lot. And the 3rd person was the Lord as a person, interfacing, communicating, talking with Abraham. Question 3 was, after learning the Lord's plans to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham intercedes. I think many of us know this. Why do you suppose Abraham believes that there are righteous people living in these cities? And so we can read Genesis 18 and 23 through 32. Why is he making this argument? And so it says, The sun had risen over the earth when Lot came to Zoar. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and he overthrew those cities and all the valleys. I must have the wrong reference, 18 through 23. I'm sorry, 23 through 32. Okay, well, we'll continue to read. The sun had risen over the earth when Lot came to Zoar. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire, and from the Lord out of heaven, and he overthrew those cities, and all the valley, and all the inhabitants of the cities, and what grew on the ground. But his wife from behind him looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. Now Abraham arose early in the morning and went to the place where he had stood before the Lord, same place we just talked about before. And he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the valley, and he saw, and behold, the smoke of the land ascended like the smoke of a furnace. And thus it came about, when God destroyed the cities of the valley, that God remembered Abraham and Lot, and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow, when he overthrew the cities of the Lord. And so we know that they're going to be destroyed, and we knew prior Abraham argued mightily with God to save them, and so the question was, why would he do that? And there are certainly several reasons. One, of course, he knew Lot was living there and his family. We know this from prior verses in the Bible. He knew that his nephew Lot was there with a family. But he argued for a lot more than just saving that family initially. In fact, he did all the way through his arguments. And so he probably believed that the length of time that Lot and his family had lived there, they would have, as Abraham had done with his servants, would have taught God's ways, would have spoken of God and witnessed about God, and had a positive influence in the city. After all, Sodom was sort of ransacked, you'll recall, once before, earlier, overrun. The king was chased off and all the people taken captive, and Abraham had to mount his own army and went off under the Lord's direction and rescued the city of Sodom and Lot. And so there was that testimony as well. So clearly, Abraham is thinking that it isn't just Lot and his family living down there that are righteous. There must be others besides his family. And probably for those reasons, his interaction prior with the city when he had to rescue it, and then knowing that Lot was living there with his family. In question 4, we can learn a lot about God's judgment of the wicked. I like this one. Judgment of the wicked by examining the story in Genesis chapter 19. And if we look in this in Genesis 19, this is the doom of Sodom. And this is all about the destruction of it, and how the angels had to come and physically drag Lot and his family, the family that would go, his 2 daughters and his wife, literally drag them out of the city before the destruction came. And you'll also, of course, recall the infamous story about his wife turning back and looking on the city and turning into brimstone. But it brought this savage destruction on the city. What can we learn from this? One of the first things that we see, obviously, in this story is God had a lot of patience with the city. Lot was there. Lot should have also been, spreading the word of God, if you will, and teaching about God in the city. A lot of patience. But then when it's time for judgment, as we found with the flood, judgment comes, and it comes quickly. But in the same with the case of the flood, God sent messengers, or in Noah's case, God spoke directly to Noah and rescued the righteous from the coming judgment. And here we see the same thing, angels being sent to rescue Lot and his family before God brings certain judgment on the wicked. We also see that in 2 Kings 19:35 as well. You'll see where he used angels to carry out his judgment as messengers, and then to carry out his judgment. And we spoke of that role when we did the course Angels and Demons. And if you've not had a chance to look at that material and study that course that we taught, you should do that. Fascinating about the missions, if you will, and the capabilities of angels. And then in question 5, does God warn of his coming judgment? Well, obviously he does. And the entire book of Revelation is a good example of warning of the coming judgment. We've got the slaves in Egypt and Moses, and again, warnings of the coming judgment. Noah, yes, God warns of judgment. This isn't a surprise. This isn't, and it's interesting 2, well, we'll see here in a second. There's another question I had is contrast the scene when the angels visited Abraham. These are the three that came up and spoke to Abraham, versus the scene when they visited Lot. And I said specifically with respect to where they were each found sitting. So again, let's go back for a moment to chapter 18 and look at verses 1 and 2. And we see now the Lord appeared to him, Abraham, by the oaks of Mamre, while he was sitting at the tent door in the heat of the day. When he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing opposite him. And when he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the earth. So Abraham is at home in his tent door looking out probably over the fields where his flocks and things are. It's a warm day apparently, in the heat of the day. Now, contrast that with where we find Lot in chapter 19, verse 1. We've read this earlier. Now the 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening as Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. And we know that the city gate in Sodom is, I don't know if it's the largest ever, but it is a large, large city gate complex. And the influential of town were there. And this, Lot's story in general is interesting from the time that he left Abraham, because they're standing there between Bethel and Ai, looking across the valley, the green valley, and Lot sees the green valley, and he sees the city of Sodom, and his eyes and his heart turn in that direction. And he camps near Sodom, and then suddenly we find him in Sodom, no longer out with the sheep and the goats and the herds that he's raising. Now he's in the city. And now we come to a time where Lot now is a man of influence and is sitting in the evening in the city gates with other men of influence within the city when the angels come. Abraham, on the other hand, was at home, in this case, having a discussion with God and 2 angels. When Lot's, so question 7, when Lot's guests are ready for bed, Lot's home is surrounded by an angry crowd of homosexual men. Compare Lot's definition of a wicked thing with what he proposes as a proper solution. And so we'll read that in verses 4 through 8. Behold, they lay down the men of the city, the men of Sodom, surrounded the house, both young and old, all the people from every quarter. And they called to Lot and said to him, Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, that we may have relations with them. Bring them out to us, and may have relations with them? But Lot went out to them at the doorway and shut the door behind him. And he said, Please, my brothers, do not act wickedly. Now behold, I have 2 daughters who have not had relations with man. Please let me bring them out to you, and do to them whatever you like. Only do nothing to these men, inasmuch as they have come under the shelter of my roof. So the men wanting to have sex with the angels, or the men who are visiting in his house, that was wrong, but it was okay if he sent his daughters out for them to have sex with. It gives you a twisted idea of Lot's logic. First of all, what's he trying to do? He's trying to appease this group of angry homosexual men who he probably knew personally. If he's sitting in the city gate, he's probably pretty well connected with everybody in the city. Probably knew these people personally. He doesn't want to just tell them no, so you can't have them, but I'll give you my daughters. I mean, really, Lot was a twisted sort of mess, if you will. Today we might say it was a one hot mess. In question 8, what biblical precept regarding God's protection from judgment is demonstrated in the reaction of the visitors to Lot's dilemma outside the house? And so we'll read first Genesis 19:9 through 11. So the crowd argues back, but they said, Stand aside. And furthermore, they said, This one came in as an alien, and already he's acting like a judge. Now they're talking about Lot now. Now they're mad. Who are you? This outsider who's in the city, you alien, you, not giving us these men. And now we will treat you worse than them. So the mob's getting really angry. So they pressed hard against Lot and came near breaking the door. But the men reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. They struck the men who were at, this is the angels now, they struck the men who were at the doorway of the house with blindness, both small and great, so that they were wearying themselves trying to find the doorway. And so the question I ask is, what biblical precept do we have here? God's protection from judgment is demonstrated, and clearly we see that even though Lot was a sinner, I mean, that's the thing that confounds people. God still saw Lot as a righteous person in terms of passing the coming judgment. Lot was going to be protected from it, as was his family, just as Noah and his family was protected. In spite of all Lot had done, there was something in there that was still righteous, and God wanted to save him. And well, I think that speaks to every one of us. Clearly, we probably don't see ourselves as wicked as Lot or evil as Lot or however you want to describe it, or maybe as confused and messed up as Lot. But you know what? None of us is righteous. The Bible says, no, not one. We all have sinned. You know, Sodom's all about this homosexual city. Okay, that's one sin in a long, long list. We've all sinned. We need to pray that God will protect each of us from the coming judgment. We need protection. And through the shed blood of Jesus Christ, we are protected. We are washed in his blood and will be saved from the coming judgment. There is no question. But many are going to be lost. Many. That entire city of Sodom was totally and utterly destroyed. What we're finding out there is mind-boggling in terms of ruins. Judgment is certain, swift, and completely accurate. We need to get the word out to the lost, just as Noah did before the flood, just as the last two witnesses will before Christ returns again. We live in a day when we are to be getting out the word. God is not asleep. God is not slumber. When it is judgment day, it'll be just, it tells us in the Bible, Old Testament and New both. They eat, drink, be merry, give in marriage, have babies, all this, everything's normal, and then in an instant it's not. We're living in that time right now where we are the ones to get the word out, because the day judgment comes, there is no longer grace. And so what we see here then is, in spite of Lot's twisted logic with the guys at the door, and here's my daughters, and all this other stuff, he is still seen as righteous in God's eyes, and is to be saved. And these two angels reach out there and snatch him back so that he's not harmed at all during this confrontation. How do we know that Lot believed in God and believed God was going to bring judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah? Well, we know that by Genesis 19, verse 14. So we'll back up just a little bit. They in verse 11, they struck the men with blindness. So in verse 12 then, the two men said to Lot, whom else do you have here? A son-in-law and your sons and your daughters, and whomever you have in the city, bring them out of the place. For we are about to destroy this place, because their outcry has become so great before the Lord that the Lord has sent us to destroy it. Now Lot's reaction is the evidence of his righteousness. Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law who were to marry his daughters, and said, Up, get out of this place, for the Lord will destroy the city. But he appeared to his son-in-laws to be jesting. If he didn't believe in God, and he didn't believe these angels, and he didn't believe judgment was coming and was coming now, he wouldn't have done any of that. So he knew the truth. Just like many of us, all of us, know how to behave. We know the truth. We know how we're to act. We know what our spirit is to be like. Even at times when we are sinning, we know it's wrong. We find convenient ways for it to not be wrong and to justify and rationalize and all these things. But we know it's wrong. And when we're confronted with the truth, we recognize the truth instantly if we have Christ living in us. And clearly, Lot recognized God, and he recognized these two angels, and he knew judgment was coming. And that's why I believe he was found to be righteous in God's eyes. Question 10 says, even though Sodom had been overrun in the prior war, and even though it would now be destroyed, did Lot now want to return up to the mountains where Abraham lived? If not, where did he want to live? And we read 15 through 23, when morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, Up, take up your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or you will be swept away in the punishment of the city. But he hesitated. So the men seized his hand and the hand of his wife and the hand of his 2 daughters, for the compassion of the Lord was upon him, and they brought him out and put him outside the city. And so even though he couldn't make up his mind and didn't want to leave, out they went. When they brought them outside, one said, Escape for your life, and do not look behind you, and do not stay anywhere in the valley. Escape to the mountains, or you will be swept away. These 2 angels knew exactly what was coming. And let me tell you, that destruction was broad across that valley. Those cities, the sister cities, Sodom, Gomorrah, and their sister cities, did not survive at all in an instant. And the angels knew this was coming. But Lot said to them, Oh, no, my Lord. Oh, no, I'm going up the mountains. No, heavens, no. No, now behold, your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have magnified your loving kindness, which you have showed me by saving my life. But I cannot escape to the mountains, for the disaster will overtake me, and I will die. So he's kind of arguing he doesn't have enough time to get to the mountains, if you will. Now behold, this town is near enough to flee to, and it is small. Please let me escape there. Is it not small, that my life may be saved? He said to him, Behold, the angel now, Behold, I grant you this request also, not to overthrow the town of which you have spoken. Hurry and escape there, for I cannot do anything until you arrive there. And therefore the name of that town was called Zoar. The sun had risen over the earth when Lot came to Zoar. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And we'll continue to read that in a moment. So he went to the city of Zoar rather than wanting to go. Yeah, it's like, why wouldn't you want to go back with your uncle and go where things are safe and go where the Lord has obviously been the center of? Why do you want to continue to stay? But when we get caught in, I guess lust is a good word for it. When we're hooked on something, we just don't want to let go of it. And he loved that lush valley, and he loved the living in the big city and the life of influence and all of that. He didn't want to leave that. Did not want to leave it. So in 11 then, Lot's wife ignores the angel's instructions and looks back as they flee and is immediately turned into a pillar of salt. The only people who are actually saved out of all the people in those 2 cities, and others that were also destroyed, by the way, are Lot and his 2 daughters. Where does Lot go to live after he witnesses the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah from Zoar? And now we go down to verse 30. And so God brings this certain destruction, and Lot sees it from Zoar. It's almost like Sodom wasn't a nuclear explosion, but you can imagine Trinity Site in New Mexico, and the folks who were off at a distance could see the mushroom cloud when it went off, kind of thing. So here's Abraham up in the mountains, seeing it across the valley, and here's Lot in the valley of the Zoar, seeing the destruction or the results of the destruction. And it says then in verse 30, Lot went up from Zoar and stayed in the mountains. So that was it. He got the picture. I don't need this valley. I'm out of here. And he hot-foots it up to the mountains. Stayed in the mountains, and his 2 daughters, of course, went with him, for he was afraid to stay in Zoar, and he stayed in a cave, he and his 2 daughters. So he ends up in a cave, he and his 2 daughters. And then we go to question 12. As the narrative indicates, the angels take Lot and his family out of the city, but they tell Lot that he has until nightfall to get to Zoar, since they will wait to bring judgment to Sodom and Gomorrah at that time. Back in Sodom, however, you need to remember this as well. After a night of bizarre behavior, okay, so we had this angry mob of homosexual men storm Lot's house. We had that whole confrontation. I'll give you my daughters. They get all mad. They're going to really come after him. The angels come out. They're blinded by the angels that whole night. Now it's daybreak. Things go back to normal in Sodom. That's interesting. Back in Sodom, after a night of bizarre behavior, the angels blinding the crowd of men and Lot running around. Oh, that's the other part. Lot ran around, warned his son-in-laws and so on, what was going on. And his daughters, peace now returns to Sodom. The troublemakers, Lot and his wife and kids, have left. The angels have chased them out of the city. The angels are still there, but they've, sent Lot on his way. The question then is, what is the parallel here between this judgment and the rapture theory and the coming judgment when Christ returns? And so in Sodom, we had this night of declaring judgment was coming. The next morning, Lot and his family are, taken out of the city, sent off into the valley. The wife ignores the instructions and dies, but Lot and his children make it safely to Zoar by evening. That whole day in Sodom, now there may have been some discussion about the uprising at Lot's house that night, but pretty much things go back to normal, and then judgment comes. And so that's what I asked the question, what is the parallel here between this and the rapture theory, if you believe in the rapture theory, for instance, or just the coming judgment when Christ returns? Well, there are several parallels. The rapture theory holds that prior to judgment, Christ will call out the saved so that the judgments referred to in the book only fall on the unsaved. And certainly this is a parallel of that in the Lot case. It also shows that once Lot and the angels left the city, life pretty much went back to normal. And the thought of any coming judgment, no. Well, if you read in Revelation, we have the same thing. We had the final two witnesses are hung in public for 3 days in the street, and everybody parties, and they send gifts to each other, and all of that, oh good, those last two witnesses about all the doom and destruction are dead and gone. Everything's fine, let's have a big party just before the final judgment. And Christ returns. We see another parallel there. The third thing I saw is that we can easily envision how this is possible even today. The Bible tells us man's heart is continually evil. Without God's intervention, man is lost. And it's the same thing. You try to tell somebody today that God's coming judgment is just around the corner, and they're pretty much going to laugh at you. Things are fine. Yeah, there's unrest in different parts of the world. We've always had unrest in different parts of the world and so on. And a Christian witnessing about the second coming of Christ is pretty much fighting a real uphill battle. Most people think you're delusional, you don't really know the real world, you don't understand the capability of the technology and mankind have today, and they have all these excuses. But the reality is God is not slow in judgment. He is patient, but when it is time for judgment, it will come, and it will come as a certainty. And so we need to let folks know that. And then the last thing I said is it also indicates to us that God's judgment comes at a time when man does not expect it. And we see that over and over and over and over again in the Bible. It always comes at a time when man does not expect it. And when it does come, it's quick and it's specific. And again, we get into a study of Exodus, and you look at, we'll see some of it in Genesis. But in any case, when we look at Moses and the plagues that God brought on Egypt, the judgments that he brought on Egypt, God had the ability to bring judgment on the Egyptians and not on the Hebrews in the exact same place. It's incredible how specific God's judgment is, and his ability and his desire to protect his loved ones, the righteous, those who follow him, from that specific judgment. And he has all sorts of unique ways of doing it. Noah and the flood was another. So God's judgments are specific, quick, and they are coming. They are certain, and we will see that on this world for certain. The book of Revelation knows what it's talking about, as do all of the Old Testament prophecies leading up to the second coming of Christ. And so, just another example. So in question 13 then, now that it's just Lot and his two daughters living in a cave, what happens to the family? So we read 30 through 38, again, fairly well known perhaps to most of you. They're living in a cave, says he went up, and so verse 31, then the firstborn of the two daughters said to the younger daughter, our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to come into us after the manner of the earth. They believe everybody's been destroyed, and the three of them are the only people on the face of the earth now. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and let us lie with him, that we may preserve our family through our father. So they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and laid with her father, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. And on the following day the firstborn said to the younger, behold, I lay last night with my father. Let us make drink wine tonight also, Then you go in and lie with him, that we may preserve our family through our father. So they made their father drink wine that night also. I'm sure it was a real hard thing to get him to drink wine. And the younger arose and lay with him, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. Thus both the daughters of Lot were with child by their father. The firstborn bore a son and called his name Moab. He is the father of the Moabites to this day. And as for the younger, she also bore a son and called his name Ben-Ami, and he is the father of the sons of the Ammon, or the Ammonites, to this day. And so two daughters give birth to two children who will then father two tribes, or nations, if you will. That's the Moabites and the Ammonites. So then I ask question 14, if you read Ruth 1 verse 2, where did David's grandmother come from? What people did they come from? And Ruth's grandmother David's grandmother came from the Moabites. And then what did David have to do with the Ammonites? And you can read that in 2 Samuel. And basically they were an enemy of Israel. And his job was he sought to defeat them in any way that he could. So the Ammonites, the child of the younger daughter, become an enemy of the nation of Israel. The Moabites actually become a part, adopted in, if you will, in a sense, the nation of Israel through David's grandmother. Amazing. The Moabites will actually then be a part of Jesus' sort of tree of life, if you're the genealogy part, if you will, through the Moabites, which is interesting. So that's our lesson for this week. Hope you've enjoyed it. There's a lot in there. We can learn a lot by looking at Lot's life, the city of Sodom, and God's judgment of it. And we're just really excited to be having the opportunity to be over there in person and excavating the ruins of that once great city. Thank you for studying with us.